All right. Hello, my name is Steve Nava. Today is August 13th, 2024, and I'm interviewing Tom Izu. And I want to start this oral history interview with the basic question of just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Let's see. I am 66 years old, um, born in Seattle, Washington. Um, I've lived most of my life, though, in the South Bay area. Um, Grew up in Sunnyvale, but um, moved there when I was 3 from Seattle, Washington. Um, and, but since I've been living in San Jose. So let's see, what else can I say about myself? I did, let's see, after school, K-12, mostly in Sunnyvale, I went to UCSC um, and graduated from there in 1980. And from there, I moved to San Jose Japantown. The reason why is that during that time period at UCSC, there was um, a growing Asian American student movement. They didn't have ethnic studies yet, but they did have some classes in Asian American studies that I helped work on, advocating for with some other students and the help of a college provost at UC Santa Cruz at the time, named Herman Blake. Um, So during that time, there were older Asian American students there that really helped promote the idea that students color should be part of this movement to go back to their communities of origin, in my case, Japanese American community, and to help those communities. And this was generally referred to as serve the people. And this was kind of part of overall mass movement and also part of the New Left too, in their outlook of trying to help oppressed communities. Um, so I took that to heart. I had my family is primarily, my parents' families primarily from San Jose area and Los Altos area, and I had a grandfather who lived in San Jose, Japantown. So I figured that's where I should go help, and that's what I did. And so I worked there in Japantown, lived and worked there, and primarily in the senior center called the UI Kai Senior Center uh, that helped Japanese American elderly because they really couldn't get any services that were in Japanese American culture at that time, except through the efforts of the community. So I became involved in that and the general community, and later became involved in a couple of different organizations. One that was very directly involved in the movement for redress reparations for Japanese Americans during the World War II mass incarceration they experienced, and that had a tremendous impact on me. And since then, I've been involved in a lot of different things. I eventually worked at the California History Center and became its executive director. I believe I was at the History Center at De Anza College for, well, probably at least 25 years, if not a little bit longer, if I include my volunteer time. I became the executive director of that museum and organization. I was uh, worked for a couple of years as a volunteer executive director because the college cut the funding from that position for a while. So my background is mainly in social service organizations, community-based ones, um, and local history work that I did through the California History Center. And a lot of my experience with local history was really influenced by my concern about communities of color in particular. And my experience doing community work in Japantown is kind of an inspirational point because while I was doing that work, I was also was connected to some other community organizations, including those that were fighting for the in the interest of, at that time it was called the Chicano movement, and undocumented, called undocumented now, but Mexicanos who um, were either immigrants or had some long time experience in San Jose, since San Jose originally was part of Mexico, of course. But through them, I learned a lot about the movement, the Chicano movement, and had a much deepened view of the similarities and the needs for our communities to work together. That also had a big impact on me. During my social service nonprofit work, besides UICI, I spent some time working with an organization called the Cannery Workers Organizing Project, which focused mainly on um, helping to organize Mexicano workers, because they were the majority of the cannery workers at the time, in their efforts to take over their union, which was the Teamsters, to run for office and become the leaders, because they had been kind of iced out of being the leaders. Many of them, most of them were women, Mexicano women. And my job with the Cannery Workers Organizing Project was mainly to write grants and raise money and do administrative stuff so that we could fund organizers who did the labor organizing work, since that was really not my background. But when you add all of these things together, that's kind of what went into my appreciation of community, the value of community, the importance of people understanding their history, and doing some of the work I ended up doing at the California History Center. Excuse me. So I retired officially from De Anza College in 2019, and I continued to be kind of a volunteer director for the center for a couple more years beyond that, until the college was able to work out a deal where they um, paid for faculty time for the executive director position, and Lori um, Richard is now the executive director. And I still help try to support the California History Center in different ways. More recently, I've been spending a lot of time focused on the needs of San Jose Japantown, and people are very concerned about its future and its viability long term. And that's kind of what I've been enmeshed in right now, including an organization called San Jose Nikkei Resisters. I also worked on an augmented reality art project in the community through a Knight Foundation grant, and this was during the middle of the pandemic, and it created augmented reality art pieces that talked about the shared history of San Jose Japantown between Chinese in Highlandville, which was the main reason why there's a Japantown, because there was a Chinatown there first, the Japanese American community in Japantown, and the Filipino American community in what we call now Pinoy Town. All three of those groups have overlapping shared histories in Japantown. And I now am also involved in the Japanese American Museum of San Jose. I'm on their advisory board. So is that good enough for a background, or
Yeah, that's good. That's plenty. And I'm probably going to bring up some of those issues,
okay,
organizations again, but
sure.
this question is more about just what was it like growing up during the time that you were growing up? What was it like as a kid?
Sure. So, as I was saying, I spent most of my childhood in Sunnyvale. We moved back when I was 3, and this was the south end of Sunnyvale, actually really close to De Anza College. Um, and it was a new development. At that time, all the orchards were being chopped down. Most of the growth, I think you can attribute to Lockheed Corporation. I wouldn't necessarily say Sunnyvale was like a company town, but it was almost like that, because Lockheed Missiles and Space Company was a big company, and there was a lot of other smaller companies that kind of served the aerospace industry. And this was a time period during the Cold War, and so a lot of the industrial organizations had shifted from agriculture, which had been the whole area prior to this, to kind of the military industrial complex, as people call it, because of the incredible increase in spending on military uh, hardware. In this case, for Lockheed, it was developing missiles and the components of missiles for submarine launch, as well as different kinds of aircraft parts. And my dad was an engineer for Lockheed. He had been one for Boeing, first of all. That's why I was born in Seattle, but he moved back to be closer to his own family, especially after one of his brothers passed away, and he wanted to take care of his mother. So anyway, growing up in Sunnyvale, I went to Cupertino Junior High. I went to elementary school, Sarah Elementary, which was close by to where we lived, Cupertino Junior High, and then eventually Homestead High School. And my experience at that time was this area was very, very much almost all white. I'm trying to remember, I think, focusing on Homestead High School at that time, I think it was, God, I can't remember now. It was something like out of the majority of 400 some students in my graduating class, I think there were maybe 7 Asians, maybe 7 or so Latinos, and maybe one Black person, and that's it. So it's changed tremendously since then, but at that time it was almost all white. And my childhood memories are that um, I wouldn't say were very pleasant because most of the time I felt very, very alienated and isolated. Um, I felt like people didn't understand who I was. And, one experience I'll share briefly is when I was a little kid in the neighborhood, I had some friends. I wasn't really close to them, but, I'd hung out with them from school. And I remember one day walking down the street from not too far from I lived in the suburban tract I lived in. Um, along with one of these people, friend, and another guy comes up who later, ironically, would become another friend of mine. Um, Comes up to greet us. He greets they're both white except for me, and he greets the white friend by saying, "Hey, how come you're hanging out with Jap face?" And this totally, of course, was very upsetting to me. The other white friend I had goes, "Oh, you shouldn't say that. That's not nice. Besides, the Chinks invented gunpowder. Don't you know that?" Or something like that. So I think at the time I really didn't understand what these people were talking about, but I kind of got this feeling this guy was trying to stand up for me by saying, I think the Chinese invented gunpowder and firecrackers. So, you should be nice to them, even though he didn't understand that I wasn't of Chinese background, but it didn't make any difference. Um, and while I know there were some nice parts of my growing up, these are the things that stand out the most, is that just feeling that people didn't understand what I was, because people would ask what I really was, where I was from. Um, it didn't make any difference if my ancestors came from Japan or not. They were all kind of the same. It was during the end of the Vietnam War, so the main thing in people's minds was these words used against the Vietnamese during the U.S. war there, like gook. So I was called that sometimes by people, chink sometimes, all sorts of stuff. And it didn't make any sense to me because I knew that I was of Japanese ancestry. But that part I didn't even know very well either because my parents really didn't talk that much about it. My grandfather on my mom's side lived in San Jose, Japantown. So now and then, probably once a month, we'd visit them. So I knew we were Japanese, but I couldn't talk to my own grandparents because they didn't speak much English. And my grandfather barely spoke at all. He just sat in this recliner chair. And I thought that was just normal, that old people just didn't talk to their grandkids. I didn't realize part of it was of what he went through because he actually, one of my older brothers told me later, he knew that my grandfather actually did speak English fairly decently, but he just didn't communicate with people. And later, I would learn that this was related to his experience being put in one of the concentration camps that Japanese Americans were put in, and that they lost almost everything, including my mom's family. Um, so it was a very childhood that was filled with these big, empty, missing parts that I didn't really understand what was missing, other than that something just wasn't adding up right. Like my parents usually talked about the camps, but it usually was when they met another Japanese American. And the thing usually would go this way is they would go, oh, they would talk a little bit about where they're from, and then they would talk about basically a question would come up like, what camp were you in? And usually there was some answer. And then eventually they would get to some point where they knew somebody who was either in the camp or close by, in some other person they knew that was in that camp. And so it was kind of this very weird social greeting. And I didn't know what the camps were really. I really didn't understand what they were. Um, and this is another part of the mystery. And so my two older brothers went to college first. We were very fortunate that we all go to college at that time. And they brought back information to me, telling me that there's whole other thing is going on. And what they're referring to is this student movement. And this movement was started in the late 60s for Asian Americans, especially in the early 70s. And one of my brothers got a subscription to a newspaper called Gidra, which was kind of a left-leaning Asian American movement paper that a lot of the students put together and had a lot of information about things that I started reading probably when I was in junior high level or high school. And I didn't totally understand everything, but I started getting this feeling that there's a whole lot more going on related to my own experience growing up that helped start filling into some of these gaps, that there was racism, that when I was growing up, when I was very, very young, I just thought there was something wrong with me, why people made fun of the way I looked, why people made fun of what the kind of foods that we ate. When I was in grammar school, I made sure my mom didn't make any Japanese food for me to bring. Um, because other kids would make fun of it. They would make gagging noises and they thought it was disgusting. Of course, ironically, years and years and years later, all these white people just love sushi and all the stuff that my family usually never ate because that's more, you know, you didn't usually eat stuff like that except for special occasions. We ate more peasant style Japanese food, but I really didn't understand any of this other than that it kind of marked me out for being unusual and not fitting in. So, so anyway, as I was still in high school, I started to realize that there was such a thing as we would refer to now as systemic racism. And that's what I was facing. It wasn't just that there was something wrong with me personally or individually, um, that my parents really didn't have a way of talking about what happened to them because they never had a chance to really discuss this even among themselves in a very complete way because they never really learned about some of the things that I was starting to learn about, especially when I went to college. And my brothers really encouraged me when I go to college, be part of the movement in different ways. They really encouraged me to do this. One of my middle brothers, uh, became really interested in cultural work. He was a musician in high school. He was a rock star in high school, but he really loved music. So he really, and he would, when he'd come home from college, he was always bringing some new instrument home. And these were traditional Chinese instruments, which also had a Japanese counterpoint. And he would be trying to play them. And they were really unusual. I'd never heard them before, but he really showed me that these are really interesting and they're very important, part of our own heritage. Then my oldest brother, um, he's the one who really encouraged me when I expressed an interest in going to UCSC because it was kind of an alternative college, and I really wanted to escape Sunnyvale and the suburbs because besides feeling I didn't feel fit in because of my race, I also just felt these new suburban tracks were very strange and uncomfortable to me. It seemed like a fake world. That's the only way I could describe it. I just had these, I think I was a little bit probably unusual as a kid because I would sit there, sitting around looking at the suburbs and wondering if all these houses were gone, what would be left? Then I started to imagining just the vegetation that was there, all the trees that people planted in their yards. What if it was only those trees and it would be a very, very strange forest? And then all the roads were kind of like little rivers or creeks that surrounded the properties. And before all of this was here, and I couldn't figure it out. It was just such, because at this time, I think I was trying to imagine what was here before. And it was so artificial. I think that's what I was starting to realize. And whole suburban life was just very fake. And I felt discomfort with that. Um, and this was kind of what I was trying to work out, along with this question of race, the suburbs, was it real or not? Um, so when my oldest brother went to UCSC, I got to visit him. I decided I want to go there to get away from the suburbs. And he did say that, well, the school is really different. It has a narrative evaluation. It doesn't have grades. So it was considered to be kind of um, counterculture in a way at that time. It wasn't like UC Berkeley, which to me seemed gigantic and a little scary because I was a pretty shy and reserved kid. So in a smaller university, I thought I could feel more comfortable. So he really influenced me. He said, well, if you're going to go there, then join the Asian American organization that's there. And so I did. And it was a small group of us that were Asian American students. We felt a kind of bond because there were so few of us there. And as I'm host, who was very supportive and said, I have some funds, so I'm going to hire some instructors to teach some Asian American studies classes because we don't have that. Herman Blake is African American. I think he was pretty well known for some of his writing. He was very, very supportive. And so he said, "Okay, you guys get a committee together, and you can hire some people to teach some classes. I'll do all the work for you. Don't worry about it." And it was very flexible. They could just be anybody, a community person that we wouldn't, we would encourage the Herman Blake to hire to teach. There were only a couple classes that these people could teach, but it covered real basic things about Asian American history, community history. And so I was heavily influenced by some of the people that we were able to have teach classes. There was somebody named Pat Sumi who taught classes, who's a very famous organizer, activist in Asian American studies stuff, I guess considered to be radical during that time. And there are a number of other people too. And in fact, Michael Omi, who later became the head of Asian American Studies at Berkeley, he retired, I think, a number of years ago. He was a graduate at UCSC at that time, so he taught some classes and he was also very supportive. So all of this had a big impact on me in developing a sense of identity, that I was Asian American, that I was a Japanese American, and that I should do something about to help fight against racism. And so the serve the people idea made a lot of sense to me, especially after Asian American Studies classes that we would go visit like Oakland, Chinatown, San Francisco, Chinatown. Um, and, we talked to different community people. So it made sense to me that I should go to San Jose, Japantown. Um, so let's see, I'm not exactly sure if I answered your question, Steve, about growing up. There's a lot of other
Yeah,
strange things
you
about
did.
Sunnyvale, but um, it seems like it's so much to try to cover.
I guess one question I could follow up with going back to earlier childhood,
Mhm.
grade school level or maybe early middle school, like what was it, what were some of the places where you really felt a sense of belonging to a group, like physical places that you would go to and bond with like-minded people or similar children, something like that?
Well, I can't think of any. I'll share one story, but before I get to that, the only thing I think that's kind of what you're talking about is I would go with my parents to visit my grandmother, my mom's side, in Japantown, and my mom had a couple of a sister who had a family and a brother, and they were cousins about my age. So we used to hang out together at my grandmother's house in particular. And those used to be the main people I would interact with. And I would ask my mom if I can go visit my cousins, and she would say sure. And so we would, she would drop us off there, or they would come over to our house. And those were the people that as a really young age, I hung out with and played with mostly. When I was at my grandmother's house, I remember hanging out with my cousins and we'd be running around like crazy. This is when we were in grammar school, really young, screaming our heads off, I assume. And my grandmother was very good-natured. She would always say, Yakamashi ne. And I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what Japanese was. And then later I learned that meant they're sure noisy, aren't they? And then all I remember is my aunties just complaining, like, hey, stop that. Don't run like that. You're going to poke your eyes out. Put that away. don't break that. You're going to break grandma's, blah, blah, blah. And they would always be doing this because years later, when I became a parent, I realized how stressful it is having kids, they're mostly boys in this case, running around like crazy. I could see how scary it was for my aunties. But I have fond memories of that. And then when there was the Obon Festival, which a Buddhist church did, they would have like a little what would you call it? Like booths with arcade kind of games. It was a fundraiser for the Buddhist church where you'd nickel tosses, dime toss, things like that. Nothing fancy. Um, so I would go there and would hang out with my cousins. And really close to where my grandmother's house was a Wiener Schnitzel restaurant. You know what that is. And we thought that was really cool because we never went to restaurants of any kind. So we'd get these hot dogs, which now I go, ew, why did I eat that? But at the time it was fun. So we would just, my parents say, okay, take some money now, just go and get out of here. So do things like that with my cousins. So, I guess that's the closest of feeling like a belonging. Although I would say though, that I did not go to the Buddhist church or the Methodist church in Japantown. The Buddhist church is where my cousins went, and they would tell stories about going to the church and being part of some of the activities. And I remember asking my mom and dad why I didn't go. Um, and my mom said she kind of told me, and I don't think I understood until later that she didn't really see herself as being part of these groups because she thought that they were really kind of like a small town kind of mindset. That Japantown was kind of like a little village. And the Buddhist church in particular, because that's the church she grew up with to some extent, was like that. Very much everybody knew everything you did, and that everybody would be watching what you did. And they made it clear that if you did anything wrong, we know who you are. And this would, your parents are going to be really ashamed of you if you do anything wrong. So basically, she was telling me that she just didn't want to be part of that. And she was, in fact, experimenting when I was a little kid. I remember being taken to a Presbyterian church, not the Japanese American Methodist church in Japantown, but this white church that was close by in Sunnyvale. And she kept checking out these different churches. I also remember once these groups of people when I was really young coming to our house in Sunnyvale. They're all dressed up, they're all Japanese, and having some talk with my mom, then leaving. And I asked Mom, who are those people? And she said, oh, they're from the whatever church it was. And in this case, they were usually from a Christian, Japanese American Christian church. Some that were one that I think might have been in Palo Alto, and maybe the one from Wesley in San Jose, Japantown. But she told me one day that we're agnostics. And I didn't know what the hell that meant. But she just said, we're agnostics. So we're not going to be part of those churches. So I thought that was cool. So I told what people I knew in my grammar school that I'm an agnostic, even though I didn't know what that meant, but it sounded good. Because sometimes kids would say what they were. They're Presbyterian or Protestant or whatever. So I thought that was cool. But so I didn't really belong to any of the Japanese American organizations other than we would go visit Japantown, like my cousins did. So my experience in grammar school, junior high and high school was pretty lonely. I just did not feel comfortable hanging out with anybody. Um, I think that's partly my personality. I was very, very shy kid too, so I was just not very outgoing. And I didn't want to go it got to the point where I really didn't want to go to even the Japanese American things. Like I didn't insist with my parents that I could go to one of the clubs or something because I just didn't know anybody. I felt like I wouldn't fit in there either. Um, so in high school, it was about like, what do you do at lunchtime? Who you're supposed to hang out with. So the people I hung out with at one time in high school was at lunchtime, really. I wasn't like great deep friends with them, but one guy he was a Jewish kid that very strongly identified as being Jewish, was a Mormon kid who identified as being Mormon. So we were, the way I look at it, not to be disparaging to them, but we were kind of misfits. So we just hung out together and had lunch together. And the Mormon kid and the Jewish kid would have these arguments. The Jewish kid was a self-proclaimed Marxist, and he kept quoting things from the Communist Manifesto. And so it was kind of an odd arrangement. And the Mormon kid was definitely a very liberal Mormon, but he was still identified with being Mormon. and I, really didn't identify with anything as far as I could tell. But so I was kind of a misfit. That's how I look at myself. Um, and other than my connection to a family, Japanese American stuff, I really didn't feel like I had a place to belong. The only other thing I would say I belonged is that my mom and dad had a garden, or yard, and so I helped my dad um, dig things up, plant things. I felt comfortable with that, and um, I guess that's about it. It just seemed being Japanese American at that time was something that I was, but it didn't seem very helpful to me. The other experience I'd share is in fourth grade. Fourth grade, they studied Japan, and I still don't understand why, because I think usually in fourth grade in California, you study the missions, but we studied Japan. Later, I figured it's probably some effort on the part of some groups in education in the United States to promote the idea that Japan was an ally. Even though it was a weird, exotic foreign country that had been our worst enemy, it was now an ally against the communists and against, because it's the Cold War. That's the only thing I can think of. So they're really promoting Japan and friendship with Japan. And some of it was obviously good intentioned because people wanted to broaden people's perspective. So my fourth grade class did a play based on a Japanese folk story. And so they had to pick an MC for the play. So guess who they picked? They picked me because I was the only Japanese American. And even though I didn't know Japanese, I probably knew how to pronounce some Japanese words better than any kids.
Mhm.
And when I came home, I said, Mom, I need a happy coat, when it's a Japanese thing, so Mom said, okay, okay, I'll get one or make one for you. When she discovered that I had to be in this play, she said, okay, I'll help you. And my dad, because the play involved chopping something down with an axe. So my dad was really good at woodworking. So he built a fake axe out of plywood for me. So I was very well supported in this, premiere of my being in a theater production, even though it wasn't very much. And I had to learn to sing Japanese songs.
Mm.
So that was, but see, the cultural thing was, so it was kind of weird. It was like I'm promoting being Japanese, even though I didn't really feel I was Japanese, but I had to play a role like that.
Mhm.
So it was a very, strange kind of experience, I think, ultimately very alienating. So it wasn't all bad, I know, but it
Mhm.
ultimately was just filled with these contradictions.
Mm. Did you feel like during high school you maybe worked out some of the contradictions or better
Um,
understood?
well, one part as I get older, I realize because I mainly tell the story of being very alienated, which I was, and being a misfit, which I was, and not being very social. But it wasn't like I was like um, uh, I think in Japan they call them hikikomori, and hikikomori are shut-ins, where they just stay at home, they don't go out. I met people like
Mhm.
that even. I think one of my cousins was kind of like that.
Mhm.
Um, so I wasn't like that. I wasn't very outgoing. I didn't go to a lot of places. But I think what I did do, which I realized, is that I started developing this kind of intellectual kind of interest in things. Because I was saying I was trying to figure out what was this place like, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. What was here? I really started wondering about things like that. And over time, it became a little more sophisticated because I knew more. So, I started learning about what was here before. It was mostly farmland. And before that, what was here, trying to imagine what the landscape was. And that it had gotten changed by people. People changed it. And so I started getting really interested in that. And I started getting interested in philosophical issues. Um, at the time, I didn't realize this is kind of related to sociology, sociological imagination, but nobody told us that. Although I remember in one middle school, some teachers telling us about dialectical materialism, even though they really didn't explain what the hell that was. They just said, "Oh yeah, this is what Marx said," and Marx was all wrong because he the means never justify the end, and he believed in revolution, so it's bad. But that word still stuck with me. That sounds interesting, and if you're a kid who's kind of intellectually inclined, you want to go look it up. So I started looking up these things. I still didn't understand what it meant, but it kind
Mhm.
of started me down this path. And then by the time I was in high school, later, I realized I went to Homestead High School that it was a pretty good high school because they had teachers there that were trying to teach things that were not in some of the high schools in another part of Sunnyvale that were mostly Latino high school, like Sunnyvale High, I think was like that, where they didn't have classes like we had. We had class of this guy who was basically a philosophy class about ethics. And
Mhm.
he tried to approach it from all these different kinds of philosophies, including Eastern philosophies, which I became really interested in because nobody usually talked about that. We had classes talking about why is there war? And we had people um, bringing up all of these different things about why is the U.S., engaged in this Cold War with the Soviet Union? What is the Soviet Union system? And so that's brought me back to starting to understand, oh, there's a whole other way of looking at society, which is, in a way to look at it, including people called somebody named Marx. And so by the time I went to college, I was really interested in this stuff. And so I already had a basis for questioning things. And I was shy, but if the teacher seemed open, I would engage them. Usually I would not talk a lot in class, and the teacher said I should talk more, but I was very uncomfortable. But later I would talk to one of the teachers about all sorts of stuff related to these philosophical questions. And I'd write these really long essays about stuff, about what is the meaning of my life and how I fit into stuff. Because I was struggling to develop my own idea of what is the nature of reality and stuff like that. I'm sure it didn't make any sense because one of my teachers very good-heartedly said, "This is a lot of gobbledygook, I think." But
Hmm.
he was supportive, he was trying to encourage me to think more. But I guess I realized more and more that that's kind of one of the things, besides starting to learn about my identity as an Asian American from my older brothers and in college, that this intellectual interest probably saved me from, getting really messed up. Meaning, really withdrawing or something.
Mhm. And did some of the, I guess, that stuff that was happening in your teenage years in terms of like intellectual interests
Hmm.
that shape your activism eventually?
Yeah, yes, it did, because I think it made me open to realizing there are different ways of looking at why the society the way it is. That historical analysis is really important because when I went to college, there were people who are activists who were teaching these Asian American Studies courses who reintroduced me to what is dialectical materialism and Marxism. And then I started taking other classes from people who were more academic oriented than the Asian American Studies people that they had there, who were more community organizers. So they talked about um, socialism and dialectical materialism and Marxism. And in fact, I took a class in Introduction to Political Economy, which was the only Marxist economist they had on the campus, I believe. And he explained, I'm only here temporary because they're not going to hire me ever. And I started learning more about the conflicts in academia, about somebody who's a who's who's self-identified as a Marxist economist probably isn't going to stand much of a chance and at that time in college. So he taught us he said this is an alternative to um, I guess you'd call it macroeconomics. And I fought hard. So the economics department is saying this is the equivalent of macroeconomics, just so you know. And
Mhm.
so he taught also all about dialectical materialism. And then the last part of the class, he just crammed in all the stuff that's supposed to be in macroeconomics, which was really, I thought was really bizarre.
Mhm.
All of these different terms and stuff that didn't make sense to me not because they were too hard to understand, but after talking about the material basis and historical analysis of things, they sounded really abstract and kind of meaningless about how you look at economics and relations. And there was another professor there who was well, I'm just blanking out. He was a famous leftist kind of professor, and he was in sociology, and really promoted, and which I didn't really understand what he was talking about because he was pretty abstract, but about the nature of the state in capitalist society and the role it plays. And there were other instructors who at different points introduced me to these different concepts. So this had a big impact on me in being open to understanding that there were different views that were considered to be radical or considered to be revolutionary, um, views that were part of the world, of other people in the world were looking at the nature of society. So yeah, it had a big impact on me in looking at the fact that, um, society is created, the way our society is set up is created by humans interacting with each other. And while individuals don't have determine everything based on their greatness or something like that, people change society, change nature itself, and change themselves. So this is kind of the basis of this is why working with other people, you can change society too, as well as changing yourself in the process. To be open to that kind of change on all that level. So that had a pretty big impact on me.
Mhm. And one of the questions that comes up is in these interviews with other folks in the oral history interviews is the question of ethnic identity. You kind of covered it a lot and, reflecting on childhood, but how important is ethnic identity to you and, reflecting on all those experiences that you brought up? Do you feel
Yeah.
like it's still relevant as an idea?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Because I think understanding my identity as a Japanese American, as an Asian American, um, helped me figure out how I fit into society, where I belonged, really. Um, but because I also had this kind of, lack of a better way of explaining, this critical view of society, this leftist kind of view of society, and this was part of the new left, time. Um, I didn't understand it at the time, but I was a product of my older cohorts, the older part of my generation, and their kind of training and experience as part of the new left. Um, um, Connecting those two things together, my identity as an Asian American, Japanese American, with the desire to change society. So I don't separate them because there were people on the left and the new left, which was a big battle,
Mm.
that focusing too much on ethnic identity, racial identity gets in the way of organizing the working class because it divides the working class. And that's just a secondary thing. It's kind of this cultural kind of thing that's not ultimately at the real base of society, which is the relation to the means of production. So it's, you're the working class or you're not. The working class is one. If you're talking about your identity, it just divides things. Yeah, there is racism and all that, but that's minor. You can unite the working class, forget that. But I knew from my experience, as I learned more and more about the history of Asian Americans and understood my own family's experience, that it is not secondary. It's very primary because it shaped entire groups of people, and that there's no way it will change and go away just by organizing the working class in the abstract or something. You have to also work with this racism, which is very, very intense. And yes, it does divide the working class. That's why you have to deal with it directly, and has a tremendous impact on society. And over time, I've seen this play out more and more to the point where it's really clear that it's a key part of understanding. It governs the chances of our society having, dramatic change or changing the systemic nature of the kind of oppression everybody faces. So I see my identity, uh, as an Asian American, Japanese American, not white person, being really key in playing a role in understanding my role also in wanting to fight for a multi-democratic society and changing the economic system, as well. That I don't think they're that separated. Um, One of the things that I became, a student of and, uh, was taught through some of the older people I worked with, in college and then beyond, especially beyond, came out of the new left movement, and they had a very particular view. They called it, and right now, I think it's an outdated term, which people probably wouldn't recognize or think was kind of odd. They called it national oppression. And I think they borrowed this from the way people in China, communist China, and the former Soviet Union talked about different ethnic groups and how they were oppressed. They were not only oppressed as workers, but they suffered oppression because they did not have the right to self-determination. And part of the New Left, you have to understand, came out of the third world liberation struggles, the movements for liberation all over the world in Africa and Asia. And so as an Asian American, the liberation struggles in Asia became very central and important to our understanding of politics. So that's what everybody was talking about. The war in Vietnam, when the war ended, what was going to happen? What was going on in all the other countries in Asia? What role did Japan play in all this? What was going on in China? And of course, all the other countries in the world were really key to other people who had roots in the United States, like African Americans. What was going on in Africa? They were all about self-determination. How come these people in their own countries can't determine their own futures and what kind of societies they have because imperialism is stopping them? So this became a really important way to try to look at it. What does this mean for us who are people of color in the United States? Does this perspective help us understand our communities? And I think it does. And I think it did, because even though Asian Americans, we don't say we have a nation in the United States, you could see that our communities also did not have the right to self-determination and were really used in all sorts of different ways. And in some cases almost totally obliterated at the whatever was needed for our capitalism and the people who were uh, operating the system, they would do that. The government would do it, everybody would do it. If they wanted, they could make money off of it. We were gone, and we were just disposable. So the view became people like us, we would call ourselves oppressed nationalities, which now is an old term, but we in our communities, we could become an ally to the white working class. And this was going to play a big role. So I still believe that. It's a little bit more updated, though, in that people who are oppressed in this country because of their race have a very important role to play. And there are elements in their communities who are not all what you would call working class, but they could be petty bourgeois, as they call them, or small business people. They still represented a fight for self-determination and democracy, which could be harnessed um, with the overall fight for changing the society and democracy. So that had a big impact on how I look at my ethnic identity and that of other groups of people that I feel strongly in solidarity with. Um, so I think it's a little bit different than some other people in my own community who might have a view of, well, Japanese American, the point of being a Japanese Americans is just to be proud of how successful we are, and this kind of model minority view. So I guess that's how I would explain it. I strongly feel that my identity is very important because I think it's just reality. It's not just something I just choose because I want to, because it's cool or makes me feel better. I think that's what I am. And that's just the actual reality because of the physical forces in the society. It created me and people like me. The other thing, though, I also realized from understanding historical analysis is that it's always in a process of change. So when I say I'm a Japanese American, that's always in the process of change. It's not like I am this way and I'm in essence this kind of person, because then people get really easily confused, even in my own community, that, well, there are Japanese cultural parts that I'm part of. I mean, I identify with the culture of Japan because I can see some of those things that were passed on to me, but in essence, they're not some kind of essential part of who I am genetically or something, because some people get really weird views. It even leads them to the point of they feel like they have to defend Japan, even to this day, no matter what it does. You know, I am loyal to that because it's my culture and it's my cultural roots. And I just tell them, like, that's a bunch of bullshit. I mean, don't you even know that there are humans in Japan? They're Japanese, but they have a whole different history than the people running Japan now, right? You don't even know that history. So it's hard for me to explain very succinctly, but it's actually this way of looking at identity, and my Japanese American identity actually does not make me feel separated from people. It actually makes me have the strength to be able to feel like I can connect with all sorts of people. And that played out when I said I helped with the Cannery Workers Project, and I met Chicano activists in San Jose who are also leftists. And it made me realize working with these people, and they would introduce me to these other people, that these people had these stories that sounded really similar to what my grandparents went through, for example. They went through some of these younger Chicano activists also. I thought, wow, they're all from, they were farm worker backgrounds. Some of them weren't. They came from families that they got to go to college, and they started developing these views about wanting to change society. And I could relate to exactly how they felt. And so all of these experiences really strengthen a sense of identity and what the point of it is, and that it's really is a dialectical process. It's a real thing that I am this, but it's determined by society, and I can't escape it. So instead, I use it for positive reasons. And I still think to this day, it plays a positive role in helping other Japanese Americans move in a way that they can help become part of this overall movement for social justice on some level, whatever level they can. So I think it's a very positive thing, not a negative thing. I definitely don't use it to measure against people, because there are some people in my community who do that. You're not Japanese enough, or you're not Japanese American. All Japanese Americans are supposed to be like this, so you don't fit that. I don't agree with that at all. I mean, um, anyway, I could go on and on about that, but that's a long-winded answer to your question.
No, that really helps. And you mentioned previously you've done projects like a virtual reality Japantown history project. You collaborated with UI Kai. You worked with UI Kai for a long time, and I believe you said you helped start UI Kai. Is that right? You helped.
No, I worked there and I became the director of the
Mhm.
UI Kai, but that was after it had already started. It started
Oh, I see.
before before my time there in the early 1980s. It started in the 1970s. But it is odd because I started working there when I was quite young, right out of college. So even though I was only the director there, I mean, I worked there for close to 8 years in all these different positions, but I was a director there for under 3 years. Um, even though I was there in the 1980s, um, there was a whole lot of other people after me who became the executive director, and they're older than I am to this day. But they refer to me as kind of an old person, even though I'm younger than them, because I was there in an earlier period. So sometimes
Hmm.
I think I was there at the beginning, because I was definitely not there. UI Kai was really inspired by the efforts of students from San Jose State and former students from San Jose State, who were part of this movement in the 1970s. That I had described, I went through, but I wasn't at there at the time in San Jose. And the Nisei, though, the second generation, people who are like my parents' generation, born in the U.S., were around during the camps for the most part. Um, they, though, also really, really were the main force working with these young people. Go, yeah, we better do something. We better do something for their own parents who were becoming elders, and the community needed help because nobody else was going to do it. And they already knew that nobody else was going to mean what I mean by that. Outside people were not going to come in. Oh, we'll build a senior center for you. We'll help your seniors. Or they can just come to our senior center and we'll find people that translate for them, or we'll hire people. They're not going to do that at the time. I mean, there's still a lot of racism then. Um, but so that's how UI Kai came about. It was a real community effort. It was what people now call mutual aid. And that's what it was. And that's something that I also learned about working in the community. That's part of this being an oppressed nationality, is what I would call it. The need for your community and all different elements of it, even if you don't all agree in the same kind of politics and you
Mhm.
have long-term differences, you still
Mhm.
work together because you're fighting against this oppression that your community has faced over the years and continues to face in different ways. It keeps changing, but you all have to work together to do that. And this working together builds this potential in you to see how you can do this in conjunction with other communities, or even in totally other organizing forms. That is how you have to do this. You have to work with communities, help them, work with all the elements in the community. So I also, going back to what you were getting at, is
Mhm.
I was involved in the Japanese American Resource Center
Mhm.
early on for a short time, and that eventually became the Japanese American Museum of San Jose. And I started being more involved in the Japanese American Museum of San Jose in the 2014, 2015 time, when I was still working at the California History Center. It kind of made it sense because they're a history museum, and California History Center supported other local history groups. So that was the other group that I worked through in the Hidden Histories of San Jose Japantown Augmented Reality Art Project. was done in conjunction with the Japanese American Museum of San Jose.
Mhm. So, could you talk a little bit about your current projects and what's an average day like for you nowadays in your work?
Well, I help still with the Japanese American Museum of San Jose. I'm on their advisory board. So I struggle a lot with things the museum struggles with. Everything from they have ups and downs. They've gone through a series of big challenges and, they've gone through several executive directors in a short period of time. They operated prior to that having no staff members. It was just all volunteer. So they're going through a lot of changes that I have some familiarity with having been involved in the Japanese American community going back to the 1980s and seeing how this kind of plays out with groups that are primarily volunteer. They start hiring a staff, and then they have to struggle with how to raise money and how they fit into the community and then the broader society overall. Um, so I try to offer help in that way. Um, the other part, though, that I'm most interested, though, because of my experiences working in the community, being an executive director at the California History Center and UICI, I'm trying to get away from doing some of that work because that was very stressful. And I am kind of a reserved guy, and I don't like having to deal with all of these personnel issues and conflicts and boards. It's very difficult. So my main interest is in more of the programming part of things. Like, what is the narrative the museum is trying to develop and struggle with? How aware are they that there is a narrative that they have? These kind of questions like that. I can't get away with those things that I was always interested going way back and kind of these, lack of a better way to put it, kind of these intellectual kind of bent um, kind of focus on things like why do we talk about Japanese Americans this way? And what is more helpful, I think, to our community and in the long run, fighting for democracy for everybody. What lessons do Japanese Americans have in that way? So I've been mostly trying to put my energy in things like that. But in a community like Japantown, that it does not have a real strong infrastructure. It does not have a whole lot of organizations and lots of funding. So there's not a whole lot of people running around with a lot of time to devote to it. Most people have to work a lot of hours or have other situations where they can't do stuff. So you end up having to do a little bit of everything. So, excuse me.
Mhm.
So for the museum, um, they're starting to hire staff now, but they had very little, hardly any staff, if any. So any of the projects you wanted to do, like this augmented reality one, you had to do on your own. You had to either find some funds to hire people, and it wouldn't be enough funds to hire somebody like a full-time job. It would just be for a short time. So that's what we did. We did it. We found the funds on our own. My Susan, my partner, and I, by getting a grant through the Knight Foundation, and we were able to just by chance hire some people who were really competent who happened to have some time at the time. So that's how we were able to do that project. And then before the museum started being able to hire more staff, I worked with other people to get these small grants. And if we needed somebody to do work, be able to pay them to do some work to develop some projects that deal more at things of most interest to me. And so example would be like Susan and I did this whole series called Don't Exclude Us. And this was in the 2016, 2017. This was the lead up and then right during the heart of the Trump administration when it was just going after immigrants big time. No question. It was like the Muslim ban and just the anti-immigrant sentiment was just at this on steroids. So our feeling was let's get the Japanese American community because we both felt that our base is in that community. We knew it the best. What can we do to get it involved in the struggle, to be able to understand what was at stake and to make sure it took the right stance on whatever level it could. And so this series of programs had things about showing the similarities between the Repatriation Act in the 1930s, or movement in the 1930s that basically deported probably close to 2 million. They say 1 million, probably more, all throughout the country, uh, people from Mexico. And these were Mexican Americans. Probably the majority of them actually were US citizens, but they were kids who got picked up and deported, thrown across the border. And some of the photos of this happening in the 1930s, and especially in Los Angeles, it didn't happen on the same level in San Jose at all, but in Los Angeles, they showed them being put on trains, black and white photos. And we noticed if you get pictures of Japanese Americans being put on trains when they're being sent off to camp, you couldn't tell the difference. The black and white photos, you couldn't tell because we were kind of brown skinned looking, and same thing. They had guards, military people there sticking them on the trains. So we were hoping that Japanese Americans can see this and understand this happened. Maybe they heard a little bit about it. They didn't understand the extent of it. This happened, and it happened to some people in San Jose and people who moved to San Jose later. And this is important to understand. So we did a program about that, and it was very successful. There were people who came there, very emotional. There was a professor from Cal State Los Angeles. He's retired now. I'm just blanking out on his name. Um, I'm sorry, forgetting his name, but he helped write a book about the repatriation, and he's probably one of the experts on it. But he came and spoke, and we tried to make these programs as creative as we could, because that's what we had learned doing other kind of political organizing work. So we had people at these series of events representing different kinds of experiences talk about the exclusion their communities had faced, but mainly from not like a lecture, but picking out a poem or picking out some quote from somebody else that they knew of if they themselves didn't go through that experience. And they would get up and read it. And so you had this kind of collage of hearing these different people's stories that sounded really similar to what happened to Mexican Americans and what was happening. We later had a program that focused on Chinese Americans and the Exclusion Act and what happened to them. And at all of these programs, we had Muslim Americans talk about the Muslim ban, because that was right at the heart at what was happening at that time period. But all of these different voices showing the similarities of their experiences, but showing that there's an emotional tie. So it's not just academic, intellectual, or somehow they can prove that it was the same. That's kind of the danger of parallelism when you say, well, it was just like that. Well, not exactly like that. We don't want to say it was as bad as slavery, because it wasn't as bad as slavery, but it was kind of like that. I mean, all of those kind of weird fights people get into, it was more, no, we can just feel it. Because when this program about repatriation, the title we decided was I Never Saw My Father Again. And that was taken out of a book written, or part of mentioned in a book about repatriation. And we thought it applied to Japanese Americans. So there are some Japanese Americans who said, well, are you sure Japanese American could relate to that? And then we said, oh, I think they could. And in fact, they did, because some Japanese Americans, when they saw that, they knew what that meant. And they would tell us, my father, we never saw him. He got taken away by the FBI before we could put in camp. And he died in custody before he could be reunited with us in camp. And we had a speaker who was a little kid at the time. His father was taken away, and he died very young. I mean, died, before this guy who could interact with him again. So it was very emotional. So people could do that, and then the Mexican American identifying people who came to this event, it was very emotional to them, and that triggered them to think about, how they could connect to our experience as well as we can connect to theirs. So we did a lot of programs like that. But they kept changing. That's why it's hard for me to say on a day-to-day basis. So after those programs were done, we did the Hidden Histories project. We developed tours based on that project, all of them with the idea of trying to show that we were trying to combat this exceptionalism view that some of the model minority Japanese Americans promoted. We were great, we were proved we were loyal, and now, we're successful, and we want to show what good Americans we are. What I sensed is that Japanese Americans, even if they weren't full blown into just trying to talk about how loyal we were, the tendency of the narrative tended to connect mostly with their relationship to white people without them being conscious of that. That's who they were speaking to, is we're loyal. Like, why do you have to say that to somebody else? Why do you have to say you're loyal? Where is that in the Constitution? It doesn't say anything about being loyal. I mean, even though they're trying to say, well, we learned lessons about the importance of the Constitution, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that you must be loyal. I mean, there's laws against, an act of treason against the United States, but
Mhm.
uh, this emotional thing about my loyalty and what you think in your head is not the same thing. So why is that? So I figured, well, it's because they're speaking to white people.
Mhm.
And I couldn't say that in front of everybody because they'd probably get offended or they wouldn't understand what I'm talking about. But that's what I thought. That's what they're doing instead of trying to more connect with all. In here. Sorry, I just accidentally hit my computer. Um, um,
What was the last thing you said?
trying to instead of just speaking in this kind of defensive way without them
Mhm.
realizing it. There's
Mhm.
probably a better way to say this, which you could probably think about.
Mhm.
Um, Instead, speak more about how you how you fit in and see how you are connected with all these other groups of people, including white people, you know.
Mhm.
But as opposed to saying my experience as Japanese Americans, these are the most important things. We were
Mhm.
loyal, we were loyal, we were loyal, and we're successful. And let's have and talk about all the great success stories. I actually don't oppose that because I understand that's part of heritage, right? That's part of heritage, developing a heritage tradition. You want to be proud. My father served in the segregated military unit during World War II.
Mhm.
And so I can understand people being proud of that, that there were Japanese Americans who went in to fight fascism. And I don't think that's something you should never say you're not proud of, but to blow it out of proportion when all these other people have done that and somehow makes you better or special and somehow will make you acceptable to white people, which it doesn't, except on a very limited way in some special circumstances. Um, that became an important part of how can we be part of developing a narrative. So Hidden Histories of San Jose Japantown, one of the things it brought out is that Japantown, the only reason Japantown's there is because there was a Chinatown, Highlandville Chinatown. That was there first. And that there were Filipinos in Japantown. We all shared the same overlapping histories anyway. It wasn't all at the same time, but um, and that's our identity as Japanese Americans. So we didn't, Susan and I, it's not that we invented this idea or we were the first to discover it. People have been talking about it for a while, but we wanted to bring it to the forefront, especially for Japanese Americans. So people like Connie Youngyu, Robert Braxack, we knew they were there, so we wanted to give them more opportunities. And
Mhm.
so that was our effort to put this into the museum. And now the museum, they talk about it that way. They say, oh yeah, Japantown, but it also they were China. We were here because of Inlandville, Chinatown, and the Filipino community history. So that they're going to do the Pinoy Town exhibit at the museum, Japanese American Museum too, in the very near future. So this was all I mean, we're not taking all credit for that, but we were part of that. That's how we saw our role is pushing for that. And that
Mhm.
involved all sorts of different things. It involved creating projects, trying to find funding for it, and involved in convincing people to do it and finding new people to connect with us. And that's why we formed the San Jose Nikkei Resisters was to be able to take positions that were directly against the Trump administration and its policies. Some of the other groups in the community we knew wouldn't be comfortable doing that. So that's why we formed that group. And it did attract younger people. Um, so going back to your question, which I didn't really answer,
Mhm.
day to day, it just kind of depends on what's going on and what this time period is. So right now, a big focus we have is on trying to figure out how Japantown can become sustainable. We're very worried about its future. Even though it looks like it's um, very in good shape, very active, um, it is very fragile because a lot of what we call the legacy businesses, um, the owners are getting pretty old, and if those families sell the businesses, we don't know who it'll go to, and whoever it goes to it could drastically change the nature of the community, what it looks like, what it feels like. So this is a big struggle. So we have been going to lots of meetings and having lots of discussions with different people. And what we're trying to do is bring people together to actually talk more because Japantown community hasn't really discussed this collectively. Individuals talk about it and have been thinking about it and worrying about it, but bringing them together to actually say, well, what do you think we can do? And if we have differences, that's okay, but we should discuss it. That really hasn't happened much. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why I think it hasn't. Uh, Kind of the trauma that people have gone through in the past and some of the past legacy that the legacy that's been brought forward to us, the positive and the negative parts, that we have to reshape to make it more possible to have a more democratic functioning in our community and the willingness to struggle over things. So that takes up a lot of time, figuring that out.
And in terms of the effect of COVID on Japantown, did you see some of that?
Yeah, so of course, just like every other place, because Japantown has the merchants and their shops are really key, or keeping it operating. A lot of them, there's a lot of restaurants in Japantown. They had a really hard time struggling, and I know they were hurt pretty badly. Um, so the mutual aid part of it is that there were efforts on the community's part um, to do different activities to encourage people to buy from Japantown. Most Japanese Americans do not live in Japantown. It's not a big residential community in that way, but to come in and to take out in orders to buy food from the restaurants to help them. And so there are a lot of different efforts like that, but it had a big impact and made it really hard on a lot of merchants and a lot of businesses. And even to this day, I think they're still trying to recover from that. The other thing that happened is during this time, because of Trump and the right-wing movement, the anti-Asian hate thing really took off. You know, when Trump said it's a China virus. And
Mhm.
so community members were really worried about Japantown and what would happen to it. We were especially worried of the elders who lived in Japantown and walking around. Would they be attacked? So there were members of our community who started safety patrols. And these are based originally from the group that did the safety group that was supposed to react during emergencies like earthquakes, fires. Um, so they decided, let's do a patrol. And the patrol point of the patrol is just to have people walking around. You didn't have to be a retired police officer or police. It was just community people, just have a presence to show that people are walking around and they're looking after anybody who's in Japantown. So San Jose Nikkei Resisters joined it. And I think our role in it was to try to make sure that the safety patrols didn't go too far in the direction some of them were going in other communities, even other Asian communities, which were really into like uh, basically anti-black stuff. You know, they're just saying, yeah, those black people, they're the ones causing problem in our Chinatown. They're the criminals, and really promoting more police presence and promoting more police violence as a way of bringing safety. And we didn't agree with that at all. And we knew some of the community members, were really concerned about that. And they thought, well, maybe we should have more police. So our role was to try to push more to have, no, that's not going to be the answer, and we're concerned too. And that the safety patrols, what we discovered is that the vandalism and things that happen in Japantown, a lot of it was more crimes of opportunity, that there and a lot of it was connected to mental health issues because there were people that regularly to this day is still a big problem are
Mhm.
wandering through Japantown and they have some kind of mental injury and they're just yelling and swearing and they're breaking things, especially at night when nobody's around. That happens. And there's still crime going on in the traditional way, but this is more related to mental health issues. And the merchants we discovered in this process wanted to have called the police on these people. And they said it doesn't do any good because the police comes, they might take the person away, but then in a couple of days they're back again. And the reason why is because there's nowhere for these people to go and there's nobody to provide care for them. The police aren't mental health people, so they're not going to provide care for them and then bring them back rehabilitated. And so we discovered there was a movement to start something that became the Trust Initiative, which basically was the county should hire mental health people. They should be put in the budget and you can call them if it's a mental health issue rather than calling the police. And generally, I think the police were okay with this because a lot of them said, that's not our job. We can't deal with this. So we're still struggling over that because we don't think it's strong enough and they need to put more money into it. But this all came out of this safety patrol is understanding these problems more and understanding what's at the basis of it rather than just putting on a performative thing about, we're anti-police and abolish them all.
Mhm.
It was more trying to figure out what is the problem our community face. and what should we be pushing for? So we're still struggling with that. That hasn't been resolved, but it's something that we learned a lot from.
Mhm. Now, in terms of the your sort of social involvement in places like Japantown and other communities, where are some places that you find yourself going to and connecting with community members? I know
Well,
you mentioned the museum. Is that one of them?
yeah, the museum is because I'm still doing a lot of projects with them, and so I like the people there. There's a person who's running the place as the acting director. I sure hope they stay there because I like talking to her and working with her. And there's a person who's in charge of the education now that I like working with, and there's some board members I really like working with. Um, so that's a place I feel I belong to, even if I have differences with some people there.
Mhm.
It's still very close and dear to me. The UI Chi is another place because I worked there a long time ago, and there are some people um, that Susan and I um, worked with uh, going way back. I left out this whole part, but
Mhm.
when we were working on the redress movement, there was another community group we were part of called the Neil Machiavelli Committee, which still exists to this day, but it's mainly only exists to put on the Day of Remembrance event, which is about the signing of Executive Order 9066, an annual event where they commemorate that. But it was heavily involved in the redress movement. So there were a whole bunch of people we worked very closely with during the redress movement. And back in, God, I can't remember, it was 2014, 2015, we held, after we were raising kids, we didn't do as much in the community when our kids were really young, but we wanted to get involved again in the community.
Mhm.
So we decided to call some of the people that we had worked with on the redress movement together because all these people were getting older and approaching a retirement age. So we asked them to have a meeting, which we called the Sansei. Sansei is our generation, third generation,
Mhm.
unfocused group. It's supposed to be making fun of focus groups because
Mhm.
we work in corporations, you know what focus groups are. And this was just a chance to talk.
Mhm.
And through that process, we were trying to encourage people like, well, what do you want to do now? Some of you were involved in the redress movement and a lot of other community things. So we should do something. And we knew on the horizon these political struggles were coming up. But so some of them had already still been doing things with the UIKI Senior Center, but they started to become so we figured out ways they can also expand, and do things that we were involved in. Some of these activities we were starting to be involved in. And one of the things we helped to start that came out of it is the UIKI has a group informally known as the lecture series that does these activities aimed at attracting younger seniors. That's what it was started for. We've covered all sorts of topics of interest. One of them was about the origins of UIKI and during out of the 1970s movement for serving the people. And we did an activity about that. A lot of the things we've been doing lately seem to be more food related since people really like that. Um, but a lot of things have to do with identity and trying to encourage people to stay involved in the Japanese American community. So I like hanging out with those people. We meet every month, with new activities. So even though some of the activities aren't real political, there's usually some connection to understanding our history better that I like to promote. And I feel very comfortable with them because I've known them for a long time, most of them. And our involvement in things overlaps quite a bit. Um, Everything from San Jose Nikkei Resisters to the museum, that they're also involved in UIKI. So that's another group that I feel very comfortable, even though I don't know a lot of the staff at UIKI anymore. I feel very comfortable going there. And I think, yeah, we actually are senior club members. We finally joined.
Oh,
Um,
wow. Okay.
but we are seniors, so we're going to try to go to some activities more, even to the lunch program. People tell us we should go there. Um, so I would say those are places I like to hang out.
And has this work that you've done with the Japanese American History Museum, also with UI Kai, and the activist movements over the years. Um, has that work influenced you in developing like special connections to other communities in addition to the Chicano community?
Well, lately I've been so heavily involved in the Japanese American community because in Japantown, you get
Mm,
involved, you get pulled into everything, or there's always something to do. So I haven't been able to do as much as I'd like, but it's always in the back of my mind. And so I want to rekindle more connections
mhm,
with the Latino community because that's a whole part of local history. And working in the California History Center helped me stay in touch with some groups. Um, the indigenous community is another one.
mhm,
A whole lot of issues to get clearer on about the indigenous people who were in this area. I think there's some things that the history has almost been erased completely. And then the African American community, um, I used to know people in it. I don't know as many people now at all, but also I'm much more interested in that community. These are all more local history connected that I want to develop many
mhm,
more ties with because to me it's a natural extension of the work I did at the California History Center and that
mhm,
I'm doing now, trying to make those connections because we come from a community that was forced faced forced removal, exclusion, segregation, expulsion, all of those things. And for Japanese Americans to understand, well, this is kind of very similar. It's actually the same forces, even though at different time periods, some different circumstances in some ways, other communities have faced. So I'm really interested in understanding more what happened to Mexican Americans after the U.S. takeover, in the war with Mexico. And because they're obviously San Jose was part of Mexico, the part in
mhm.
downtown that was I can't remember what they call it. There's a bunch of different names they call it, but was kind of like a little segregated community for a while as the Yankees took over. And so there's a whole history there that's just almost erased. I mean, some people generally know there are Mexicans here, but they just don't seem to know much about it. So bringing that to the forefront is really important. And then you get into all these complicated issues with indigenous people because the Mexicans were there. They had land grants, and that land grant, of course, land came from the indigenous people. There were the Spanish people before them, before the Mexicans got their independence. They took all the land from indigenous people. So there's this whole string history going through all of those pretty intense. And I think that's part of why some of the history is hard to uncover because it's a long period of time, like African Americans, which is kind of overwhelming in some ways.
Another question is, has the cost of living and the rise in housing costs affected the Japantown community's ability to sustain some of the work of maintaining it?
Oh yeah. Oh, I think it definitely has. One thing is people can't afford to live in Japantown or around Japantown. And I mean anybody, even older people, but I'm mainly thinking of younger people, maybe people with families. Um, they can't afford to live here. So when I was young, I got to work at UI High and I was working under what used to be called the CETA program, a government program. And later I discovered this was poverty level wages. I didn't know that at the time, but I could afford to rent a studio apartment in Japantown. I mean, it wasn't the most luxurious place to say the least, but I could live there on my own. There's no way anybody could live anywhere in Japantown for the amount of money I was making. So working in a store or shop, um, I don't see how you could afford to be there unless you had a spouse or a family that had more money that could allow you to do that, or you inherited a house or something.
Mhm.
You just can't do it. So that means we're not going to get an influx of young people being uh, hanging out. It's going to be a lot harder for them. They're going to be out further in the suburbs, um, and they're going to stay there probably. I mean, so that's the problem, a big problem that we're saying we need to have jobs in Japantown so we can actually have some staff people who can help do things, but we need to make it a place affordable by more people and not just people with a lot of money, because these housing developments that are going up and wiping out parts of the area, Japantown and around Japantown, they're extremely expensive. They're just, outrageously expensive, as everybody already knows this. So yeah, it makes it really hard. If somebody sells property in Japantown, it takes a lot of money to be able to purchase that property. If the owner wants to sell it to make sure it goes into community and they can't afford just to give it away because there's all these pressures on them, it has to be close to market rate and it's just really, really expensive. So yeah, this really makes it harder to figure out how to come up with the funds to be able to save some of that buildings and businesses.
And one thing that came up in previous interviews in this oral histories project focused a lot on belonging to a community and local space. What is the role of the artist, the muralist in the future of Japantown, do you think?
Mhm. I think they play a really important role because one thing I learned, I'm not an artist,
Mhm.
but I learned that any kind of organizing work you do, and when I say excuse me, when I say
Mhm.
organizing work, I mean that in a very broad way. It's not like professional
Mhm.
organizers or a certain kind of radical organizer.
Mhm.
When people do things just to make sure their church functions, have activities and events, the thing that I've learned is how important culture and the work of people who have more of an artistic view can have on the success of that kind of work. And I want more people to see themselves playing that role because they may not see themselves as I'm a real artist. Maybe they'll feel uncomfortable with saying that. An example I'll give is there's always been a tradition in our community, Japanese American community, mainly of women, mostly it's been women, who have carried out some of these things that people refer to as traditional Japanese art, cultural art. But they've also been doing crafts and art, which have Japanese cultural aspects to it, but aren't just traditional Japanese run kind of cultural activities. They've been doing this for years and years and years, and they've been carrying this on through the churches and community organizations. And when they're called upon to help support things, they're really key because they can call out the people in making food, call out the people in making crafts that they sell or show people. It has a big impact on the spirits people have about being involved. Now, younger generation artists becoming part of that is really, really important. Not only this traditional part, but connecting all this together to show that why the culture, why having this community, the dynamicness of it, and how important it is to have this kind of a life, because otherwise it's really hard to have any sense of hope, really hard to have any sense that you can do anything. It's really hard to have a feeling that you can do anything together, especially. So artists, I think, can help bring people together. And I think they do, because so it is a really key part. And that's something that I think some of the younger people who are concerned about the future of Japantown, I think that's what they're thinking about. What kind of businesses can we have here that
Mhm.
can not only support the life of the community, which is restaurants and stores, but the cultural component of it? Can some of the cultural art things that are happening now, can they become more sustainable in the long term? Because it's really hard for people to do businesses in arts. So that's what I'm hoping is that we can figure out a way to work together, because that's going to be a real key component. I'm really worried though that culture, of course, gets used against us all the time, meaning people go, "Wow, I really love this cultural thing," and they buy it and they buy the whole thing out, and then they can make it themselves, but they really can't. It just becomes a commodity.
Mhm.
That's is not the same. So that's something that we have to figure out how to talk about.
Oh, do you mean like you mean like outsiders kind of mass producing things that they see happening?
Yeah, so I'll give an example. And all of these need to be discussed out. And that's why it's so dynamic. It's like one person can't figure it all out.
Yeah.
But so there's a people like anime, people like K-pop, J-pop, Japanese,
Mhm.
Korean culture. We started talking about pop
Mhm.
culture. And there's parts of it that are very dynamic. And I don't oppose that. That's just reality. So merchants in San Jose, Japantown, some of them sell products from this. It doesn't have as strong a component as like San Francisco, where San Francisco is a whole other story where large parts of it got wiped out in redevelopment. And so businesses from Japan outside the community came in and to set up shop. And so now there's a pretty booming um, attraction for Asian Americans, mostly, I think somebody said they thought they're mostly Chinese, but all sorts of people coming in to buy uh, Japanese, Korean cultural pop culture stuff. Little Tokyo and Los Angeles, same thing. Um, San Jose is much smaller, so it's not quite at that point, but you could see that as becoming possibly part of its future. So how do you deal with that?
Mhm.
And then the layer you're talking about is even more so, not just talking about outside interests from Japan, China, or wherever,
Mhm.
or South Korea, for example, but people saying, hey, I can sell Japanese products and I can even do it better. I can make more money off of it. People like that thinking that they're doing some good thing and they're
Mhm.
actually really, really not.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, I'm talking the kind of cultural stuff I'm talking about is how people have made yoga. They say,
Mhm.
I know yoga and I could teach it to you without all the baggage. What they're
Mhm.
referring to as cultural stuff. So I went to this talk, which was really good, about some young Buddhist Americans talking about how they feel they're really upset about how Buddhism is getting taken over this way.
Mhm.
You know, that I can teach you a form of meditation, but without all the cultural baggage. What they're referring to is the actual religion that it came out of, or the beliefs
Right.
that it came out of. It's just pure, and your company can take it up without having it to be part of this cultural stuff. You know,
Yeah.
so it's like that. So you can see the same thing happening with Japanese American products, like people riffing off of the popularity of ramen noodles or whatever, and making it into this new thing. And they think they've discovered something new because I saw people doing really having this strange attitude that they've invented this kind of Hawaiian style Japanese food, and they're white people. And you
Mhm.
have to tell them, you didn't invent that.
Mhm.
And understand how that looks. People are going to be really mad at you if you do this for good reason. So you have to, I mean, it's not like, you can't be part of this, but if you think you can just take it over, it, people aren't going to like it because you're kind of erasing the whole history and their culture. So
Mhm.
you should try to work with us, not try to take things away from us.
Mhm.
But that's problematic. I mean, you understand it's so difficult.
Yeah.
You need to have a lot more people talk about it. Got to talk it through, in our own community, really, first, because otherwise it's really hard to deal with.
Are there any last things that you might want to mention in it to add to what we've already talked about, or is there anything that we left out? Questions that I should have asked you?
Mm.
Let me see.
No, I think there's just so much to talk about that.
Yeah, it's so much.
Yeah.
I think we covered all the questions that I had. I just
Okay.
wondering if there's anything that you wanted to say that you didn't get the chance to mention.
Not really. I think I'm just what I'm most interested in trying to work out now is just that this dynamic process of understanding your historical background. I didn't talk a lot about why I think local history is so important, but
Mhm.
it's connected to that. And that if you don't, and then of course place, if you don't have a sense of, your history, your place, where you came from, no matter where you came from, nothing to be ashamed about because
Yeah.
you come from somewhere, but that there's this kind of historical process that's taken. And you can look back on it and try to reinterpret it. I think everybody should do that. But there's a fact to that's you came from somewhere, and that's what you have to honor that. But also don't get caught in it because it's not static. It keeps
Mhm.
changing. And if you get caught in it, and you think it's frozen in time, and you essentialize things too much,
Mhm.
then you're really dooming yourself. You'll never be able to deal with some of these contradictions very well because you won't understand what they are. You'll spend all your time fighting against them. And
Mhm.
that's one thing I do not want to end up. I do not, as I get older, I don't want to end up being a prejudiced old guy who
Mhm.
can't understand anything. That's a stereotype, but
Yeah.
there's some truth to it. But it happens to young people too.
Yeah. Do you think there's the role of this nostalgia plays a role in that sentiment of getting stuck, or do you think that
You know,
nostalgia would be a good emotion?
I think it's an emotion, and therefore you can't say it's bad, it's good, there's something wrong with you. I mean, we all feel it. I
Hmm.
think it's how you use it, and the basis you use, how you develop what it means. I think that's the main thing is what is the meaning of it to you? So you can see how nostalgia can get used in a really bad way when they use the feelings in the wrong way. I mean, the Trump campaign is based on that. They're saying, let's go back to make America great again. But they're not even explaining what do you mean? What America that was great again? What
Mhm.
America? They're not that America they're talking about never even existed. So, and it's all based on, a false premise. And so, but you can even see that on locally, like, oh, this place used to be so beautiful, it's all orchards. But then you're leaving out the history, like, well, the land was taken from somebody. You realize that, Asian Americans, they had to work their asses off to make this a beautiful agricultural, economic functioning engine. So are you leaving all that out in your nostalgia? But there are feelings like that. Even people who had to work really hard, there are feelings about back then, they'll tell you these stories. And they are nostalgic stories, but they're not romanticizing, they're not leaving out how hard it was, but they're still feeling a connection to the land in this, if it's agriculture, what they grew. And that's part of nostalgia, I think, because it
Mhm.
doesn't exist anymore. Um, so I'm not probably not answering your question very clearly, but it's more of what is the meaning of it? I think people need to think about it. So it's not like you should be nostalgic or you shouldn't, because I don't think that makes any sense. It's a feeling. There's nothing wrong with having feelings,
Mhm.
but it's like, what is the purpose of it? And you can use it in a good way or a bad way. Maybe that's how to try to figure that out. And you have to decide, you have to figure that out. You have to be open to struggling about it.
Yeah, that makes sense actually. Yeah, it does because I mean, everybody has to look backward and see what they experienced, but they still have to make meaning out of it,
Yeah,
whether it's clear or not, or with contradictory or not. So
right, right.
make peace with it.
Except the contradictions. I mean, that's the thing that people need to be willing to accept contradictions all over the place because that's what we are as humans. There's no way to escape it, and then learn how to deal with it, to do something positive. Good.
Yes. Yeah, I guess the next conversation could be about how capitalism might play a role in diversifying the amount of contradictions that we have to
Yeah, yeah.
face, right? 'Cause
Yep. That's true. Because
that's another Pandora's box, I guess.
yeah,
So
yeah. No, you're right. That's something I really would love to talk about to get a better understanding because it amplifies some and makes even new ones out of things that
mhm,
maybe weren't quite the same kind of contradictions they are now.
right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. We went over time, but I think we
Oh,
got an extra 30 minutes or more
okay.
of
Thank you.
powerful analysis. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Steve.
All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.